Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the last of the lectures for this semester of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at California State University, Fresno. We're honored to have our guest here, who is a alumnus of this college, and who has published widely, including lots of poems about the Portuguese-American experience in the Valley, in California, and throughout the U.S. I'm going to, first of all, thank all of you for being here. I know it's getting close to the holidays and people are thinking about all kinds of other things, but thank you all for attending. Thank you all for being here. We're happy to have you here, and I believe that you'll enjoy the presentation today. So Sam Pereira lives in the city of Los Banos, just west here of Fresno, and I'm just going to read to you a brief, not full paragraph, from a good friend of ours, of Frank and myself, Sam and myself, Frank Gaspar, who wrote to the forwards to the book, The Marriage of the Portuguese. And so please give me a couple minutes just for this. So, and who is Sam Pereira? Because I believe that he just answers who is Sam Pereira much better than I could read a bunch of things about Sam. I think in this half a paragraph, he kind of sums up who Sam Pereira is. And again, this is from Frank Gaspar. And who is Sam Pereira? It is a fair question to ask. One might answer that he's a Portuguese-American poet, a Californian, a graduate of the prestigious Iowa Writers' Workshop, a writer's writer who is read and respected among his peers. One might also say that through his wonderful poems, he is a figure, a character, more than himself, the way Whitman becomes more than himself, the way that Frost becomes the canny farmer who is not himself, and, dare we say, the way any one of Pessoa's heteronyms is Pessoa, but more than Pessoa. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our pleasure to bring to the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute here at Fresno State, poet Sam Pereira.
Thank you, Diniz. Oh, God. You gotta love Frank. I wish I was that good. Okay. First of all, this was called, where is it? Creating a Third Country, yes. Somebody asked me for a title, and I'm really good with titles, but that's where it ends, okay? This is a poetry reading, and I think what I had in mind when I said that was that it's a combination of what I've gleaned from my ancestors and what I know from my own life here in the United States, which is, I like to think considerable. As I was saying, the poems that I intend to read tonight have some connection to my ancestry. In a couple of cases, they have a connection to Fresno. And I'm hoping to get through all of them. This whole thing might take close to an hour, so those of you that want to leave now, it's okay. I want to begin with a poem that I wrote. I came here 52 years ago as an 18-year-old from Los Banos. And one of the first classes that I took, first writing classes that I took, was from a guy named C.G. Hanslacek, Chuck Hanslacek, who is here tonight, and I'm really happy that he is, he and Diane. I remember writing this poem, and I remember discussing this poem in his class. And it's a poem that took about, 15, 20 minutes to write. And it won't leave me alone. It's still here 50 some years later, and it's been fairly good to me. It's the title of the first book called The Marriage of the Portuguese, and the title is part of the poem. The marriage of the Portuguese implies something beautiful. A dark man clutching a tuna like it was his little girl. It implies a marriage at sea, life as long as the water. Nothing breaks it. And when the woman dies first, as she invariably does, the scarved body is tossed off the coast of Saint George. It is about this body that he thinks as he splits the tuna in two and breathes in deeply. It is about the long gone meat of his woman, about the sea who turned thief, the sea who stuck fingers into the corpse, plucked the child, and laughs now at this fisherman who finds only fish. When I was about 6 or 7 years old and first started elementary school, I went to a parochial school, and nuns sometimes appear in my poems. They're not going to appear in this one. But when I would finish school every day, both my parents worked, so I was told to walk over to my grandmother's house. And my grandmother was, you know, she had come over, she had never learned, like I don't know Portuguese, she didn't know English. But we would go to her house, me and my brothers and sisters, and this is a poem about that. It's called The Sugars of Terceira. My family came from that island, my ancestors. Let's say I could understand every word she said. I couldn't. The translation was laid out in black beads that took the story just so far. Before rebellion kicked in. I loved her for trying, though. I loved her for the hard cookies we all referred to as bulls. She made them because they pleased us. Filled with fresh butter and what seemed cups of sugar. They'd require genuine gnawing to get through. Any dentist worth his salt would say these things showed at the very least a lack of caution. I hate dentists for their certainty. I loved her. She knew before we'd figure it out, sweetness was a lie in any language. Then she'd smile and give them to us anyway. Also, about the same time, I lived on a block that was largely, it consisted of Portuguese families. And I say a block because there was a lot of vacant land there at the time. It isn't true anymore, but the houses that were there had my family and several others. And one family in particular had a kid who was about my age, and we became friends because there was like a white picket fence between the two houses, and you know, we would end up playing, I'm sorry to say, war, where we would conquer mysterious factions on the other side of some hill. And his name was Johnny Rodriguez. We took different paths. He ended up going to Vietnam, and he survived. It's not one of those stories. But he had a fairly hard life. And this discusses or talks about a time when he and I were playing these battle games. It's called a personal version of therapy. In 1956, in a mud-scarred vacant lot, Johnny Rodriguez killed 14 imaginary soldiers from the other side of the world. I watched his corporal of thought, a future slug in the affairs of planets. I watched, knowing deaths would be forgotten by lunchtime over bowls of tomato soup and saltines. There'd be no flag-folding ceremony amidst the dogs and cats of Mercy Springs Road. There would only be Johnny, my trouble-finding friend, off into contact with at least 2 wives and a final noble life, cutting lawns for pretending rich. I believe 40 years after the taking of a quiet neighborhood hill, that poetry planted itself in the imaginary pillage and sweat of 7-year-olds. It's like this. The world does its absolute best to riddle a chest full of believable shrapnel. Some of it will tear a heart, leaving it choking. Of course, no one responds to its calls for water, for a glass of delicious water. Certainly now there remains only the blanched decay of rumor. The world was sitting in its kitchen having tomato soup and saltines. One of the things I remember about the Portuguese aspects of my growing up was the what seemed like a weekly festa. It wasn't, but it seemed like. And I was okay with it because I liked the food. This is called Dinner for Our Lady of, and I'm sure it might bother some people. It's written with a great deal of affection for the idea of the festas. And I was an altar boy when I was growing up, and I took part in many of those. So God knows what happened, but here I am today. Dinner for Our Lady of. Banners from the old ways line the streets. Portugal takes California on Sunday. The easiest day for it. The beach is full and the churches waiting. It's time for the statues to come out of hiding. Time for the saints to be carted down blacktop 2 miles, up the steps to the hall, built by these people's ancestors 50 years ago. Inside, the saints provide food, dark bottles of orange soda, beer, food, made up of a secret soup that only a few ever get the plans to. There is a consistent smattering of mint, but that's all anyone knows for sure. That and the shredded stew of the locally donated cow. A cow who has served her purpose and not given milk like her sisters. One for the virgin, one for St. Anthony, one for Portugal, and one for Italy. For anyone, whoever, and that is fact. Sopped in French bread, surrounded by the deliciously sorry cow, this meal for the faithful, which I do not laugh at, this evening of raging dances and rosaries, which prevails and cries, prevails and cries. I wrote a book several years ago titled Dusting on Sunday. And I can't begin to tell you how many people thought it was about cleaning the house. But it's not. So let me explain this a little bit. This is the title poem. And what happened was, it takes place, my wife and I were still, hadn't gotten out of bed. It was a Sunday morning. And we live on the outskirts of the city limits, or just at where the city becomes the county. So across the street from us is a field, which is heavily used. It's, various crops year-round. And we heard this noise, and I looked out the window, and there were 2 helicopters crop dusting the field. And they were so low that you could actually see the people in them, who were, using, had headsets on, and were having a great time. I mean, I could see, even from across the street, they were really digging what they were doing. So, this is not a light poem, but that's what was the impetus for it. Dusting on Sunday, and it has an epigraph from my friend Larry Levis, who is no longer with us. It is the unremarkable that will last. And every time I look at that, I think Larry was remarkable, and he's not here anymore. And I'm not so remarkable, and here I am giving a reading at Fresno State. So that's, Anyway, this morning 2 helicopters dusted a field next to us. It's fascinating to watch as the pilots smile and dive within inches of a neighbor's alfalfa. I'm certain they are thinking about a time in Nam when the rice had arms and legs and could be seen running from them in the humid breeze. We made love as these choppers swerved, the men inside listening to cellos, perhaps, and dropping chemicals, this time to make everything grow. It remains our small fantasy, of course. She becomes my young Vietnamese girl, smiling at me, her corporal, who seems intent on death through the challenges demanded by sweat. As helicopters go, it's just sound. Our dog looks up at the sky, now blue and only blue. We listen to the baffling yet necessary silence, wondering if the moistened crop ever really understands it's just been moved and conquered. I continue reading an old friend's poems, hoping the dead understand the urgency of staying between mountains. Growing up, we had a dog, was an English sheepdog, and given the times, this was like in the 1950s, it would seem cruel now, but that dog stayed outside. My father built a doghouse for him. He was chained in the area, and every now and then the dog would get loose and run through the neighborhood and bring back prizes for everybody. And this is about him. It's also about my father dying of cancer. It's called Dog and Father, and believe me, there's a connection. The dog barked that year, delighted with its gift to the family. A crow with a broken wing, barely alive and struggling to remain here in its mind on the planet of remarkable birds. When Bingo the dog barked, we ran out and scolded him for the effort. I remember the look of sadness that came over him, not unlike the look my father unleashed that morning before his final sunrise in 1985. He'd been in the throes of cancer, so looking sad was pretty much the only vestige of giving he had left. His dark eyes glistened in that special way those about to leave us give off. The crow had it too. Speaking of that crow, it died when Bingo, in his excitement, stepped on the other wing. My father left us some time later. This then is about gifts and the unconscionable sadness they bring. I mentioned my father building a doghouse. My father worked in a creamery when he and my mother first married, and he spent his entire life working in one form or another for that place. But he was also, in the beginning, a carpenter. He worked building houses. In fact, he pretty much single-handedly built the house that we grew up in his off hours. He would go and he would do what he could, and sooner or later, presto, house. He worked for a man named Frank Pereira, no relation, but everybody called Frank Pereira Frank Beans. I never found out why. It sounds like somebody that you probably run across in The Sopranos, but this was a Portuguese guy. So this is a poem to him, to Frank, who I never really knew. I met him, but I was just a little kid. It's called One for the Contractor, Frank Beans. My father built homes for you back in the 50s. He also worked hard processing butter before margarine slid in onto the store shelves. I never got how Beans became what you were called, even though it was not your real last name. I liked it though. It was cool that we Portuguese could take something real off our tables and make it a part of our lives. Everyone would ask, "How's Frank Beans doing these days?" My father would say, "He gives me nails and sandpaper and shellac. He's a good man." I like these stories. They take me back to a time when houses were strong. Okay. I debated whether or not to read this one, but I'm going to read it. It'll give you a little bit of the the start of what got me into a lot of trouble. I had a cousin, and this cousin was much better off than we were. He got everything he wanted whenever he wanted it. He was a nice guy, but he was spoiled. So when he got his driver's license at 16, his parents gave him a 1965 candy apple red Mustang convertible, brand new. And because I said he was nice, and he was, one day he said, because I had just gotten my license soon after, said, you want to take it out for a drive? I was floored. I mean, I didn't expect that. But I took him up on it. So this is called Mustang Sammy. The nuns called me Sammy. I hated that. He sits here with a nice mocha Java which tells the world his age, coincidentally. Lattes being the thing. He contemplates an afternoon his cousin let him drive the red 65 Mustang top down into the wealthy section of that particular year's America. At 16, he pulled out a fresh pack of Camels, grabbed from a machine off Pacheco Boulevard, lit one up, and honked the horn passing some cheerleader's house. He remembers getting drunk at a carnival that same year on a combination of homemade Portuguese wine and Old Crow, mixed with flourish and a certain adolescent finesse. Then poured into a canning jar. He lifted the booze from his old man's collection of holiday spirits. This was before the advent of Mustangs being used as context clues. Before the future decided to wait, marinating. The world was expected any minute with its whiskey-free breath whispering her name, which remained a genuine context no one would ever really understand. Being clueless, after all, to the blue smoke and cold gasoline of history. This is, I said that there was at least one poem in here about Fresno, and this is it. William Saroyan was, and still is as far as I know, one of the great historical facts of Fresno. William Saroyan was alive when I came to Fresno State to study. And at one point, I was taking a class in, it was called San Francisco Beat Poets, I believe. I don't know if you can still do that, but I took a class on it. And the guy that was teaching it was Armenian, and he, his name was David Kurdian. And one night he took his class and said, come over to the house and we'll have the class there. And we did, and he said, oh, by the way, this is William Saroyan, who's just, like sitting there, this old man, didn't take part in the class, he was just there. And it was mind-boggling. So years later, this is a poem that includes William Saroyan. It has mention of Ernest Hemingway, who killed himself, if you're not aware, with a shotgun. I'm only saying this because I need to explain these a little bit. It mentions Cedar Avenue, which I don't need to explain. And it mentions Philip Levine, which I don't need to explain. It's called Saroyan City then, like it was Saroyan City then. No one ever said Fresno was the Paris of the San Joaquin, but some of us thought it. William Saroyan in the role of William Saroyan. It was like living down the block from Hemingway, only without the shotgun. And our Hemingway rode a bicycle those days. People always laugh at this, but you could sit and wait for a bus on Cedar, chewing a donut and nursing a hot cup of coffee, thinking the woman on the bench with you had oiled herself by the pool the day before and rinsed most of it off in the deep end afterward. You smile at her, swallowing what's left of breakfast. You say what's been certain to you for months, it seems, that Fresno and Paris remain a religion to you and most of your friends. You swear she will remember you stepping on your bus and throwing her a kiss. Saroyan rides by at exactly the same time. She is throwing him a kiss. Philip Levine has been here for almost 10 years now. Soon, none of this will ever get mentioned again. Fresno being a lot like Paris back then. I took a kind of an odd route from graduate school. I went to Iowa and I came back and I spent the next 21 years working in a feed and seed store, driving forklift and putting bags of feed and seed onto dairymen's pickups, back seats of Volkswagens, whatever they had, until I became a teacher 21 years later and spent that amount of time teaching. So there's a very odd thing that went on there, but I like to think that during that time I was working in this store, something got granted to me that I wouldn't have gotten any other way. And there was an old man who used to come into the store on a regular basis. His name was George Rocha. And for some reason, George took a liking to me. He struggled a little bit with language, but he found me kind of interesting, I guess. And I certainly found him that. This is called The Wisdom Came Riding In on a Flatbed for George Rocha. He would pull up in his old Chevy flatbed that had been repainted using a brush and a can of red paint. The Roytan in his mouth wet and chewed with a vengeance from the time he'd left home. I was 25 or so, fresh out of college and hope. He'd stare at me, the stare of the gruff old bastard he'd honed from the dust of dried manure all those years. For some unknown reason, he liked me. He'd say, "Sam," in his bold Portuguese accent, "you're a smart kid. Don't ever give that up." Maybe it was because he could tell I'd screw up, fall down, become a fool for all the usual reasons a man becomes a fool. Maybe he could see himself in the college kid who knew it all and at the same time didn't know a thing. He'd buy his 2 or 3 sacks of grain for the animals he had left. He'd jump into the dark green ragged seat of the Chevy, grab the knob of the long black floor shift, and throw it into a reverse he only wished was true. Funny, the things a man remembers. Like the day I asked him what he liked to read. He humored me. A bunch of yellow papers on how to fix a pump. A list of parts for this old truck and my tractor. The Bible I brought with me from Terceira on the day I boarded the ship. Those papers and that list of parts still help a lot. He smiled. A box of Roy Tans, back in the day, 50 of them, cost under $5 anywhere in town. I owed him at least a case of them for showing me his gruff hold on the world back then. His glancing follow-up grin aimed at the due respect I'd just given him. One of the things I wish I had learned, and I had the opportunity to learn Portuguese when I was a very young boy. My grandmother could have taught me, but I didn't take the time. I didn't think it was that big a deal. And now that, that didn't happen. My grandmother and my aunts, who took care of her, used to listen to a Portuguese radio personality named Joaquin Esteves, who met with a very sort of tragic, not sort of, a very tragic end. He was kidnapped and his body was never found. And they arrested somebody who eventually pled guilty to it, and because they found the guy wearing, like his sweater and some of his jewelry and stuff like that. But I remember my grandmother listening to this guy on the radio, and my aunts. And most of you who are old enough to remember what power radio is, the people that are on the other side of the microphone, just you get very, very closely attached to. You don't get that with television. You don't get that with movies. They become a part of your life. So this is a poem that includes Joaquin Esteves. It includes my grandmother, and it is a sort of repetition in some ways of that second poem I read about, my grandmother and me. But it goes into a little more detail. It ends with some Portuguese phrases. I'm probably not going to, I'll read them in English except for the ones I know I'm pronouncing correctly. They look better on the page in Portuguese. This is called To Those Expecting to Hear This in Portuguese. Boa noite. And that concludes my notes in Portuguese. I'm sorry. I wanted to sound like everyone's favorite Portuguese radio guy from the 60s, Joaquin Esteves, who disappeared over 30 years ago in San Jose and never returned to the air or the break of any existing day. I was kidnapped as a child by the forces of American TV. I'd walk to my grandmother's every day after school. I remember she lived across the street from the local Catholic church, which housed a crazy Portuguese priest who looked like the chain-smoking Marcello Mastroianni that he wanted to be. Every day I'd turn on my Avaz TV, and Dick Clark would teach us both to dance. while she poured me a Coke, always adding an occasional bull, the only way I could say it, a Portuguese cookie as hard as a rock in any language. It was something to gnaw on, and I did most of my best 7-year-old thinking and gnawing back in the days Dick was presenting The Killer, Jerry Lee Lewis, or some other blonde miscreant from America's burgeoning music scene. My grandmother would giggle in Portuguese as her worn rosary swayed to a language she couldn't make sense of, but the bulls remained sweet, the Coke a combination of looming darkness and love. All of this seemed profound, transcribed in English as always, except for those handfuls of words I'd managed to place behind my eyes for later use. Familia, the late Joaquin Esteves, the Radio Portuguesa, the crazy priest who lived across the street, of all. Fernando Pessoa, you heard Diniz mentioned earlier, has always been a fascination for me. He's a very complicated poet. He wrote in what are known as heteronyms many times. They were characters that you wondered sometimes if Pessoa himself actually believed that he was the people that he gave the poems credit for. Thanksgiving, I wrote this. It's called Thanksgiving with Pessoa, and it's dedicated to a friend who recently passed away, a gentleman named George Montero, who taught for many, many years at Brown University and was the most caring person, one of the most caring people I've ever met, who I didn't meet him, as a matter of fact, but I know him from online. And he always took interest in what I was doing and would, discuss things. So it was particularly disturbing to me when I heard that he had passed away. This is called Thanksgiving with Pessoa. George also wrote a book of his poems, a very thick book, which uses Pessoa as a sort of model, I suppose. I have taken the Cornish hens from the freezer to thaw. For the next 2 days, they will converge in the fridge with the eggs and yesterday's soup. I sometimes think this by the fire. What if Pessoa had been a bird? I also find a strange connection to him and any one of his nefarious heteronyms at once. Then comes the ultimate creative chess move. I wonder if either myself or the great and mysterious Pessoa alone could settle for taking up residence in a box along with the eggs, along with the soup, when our blood goes on telling us there are fish out there with our names on them. All the great tuna live in Mallorca now, which leaves sardines and a random octopus for the rest of us. Fernando's been dead forever. So too, each of his somber guys went with him, which leaves me, who also kept a trunk filled with the scandalous correspondences and photos of old loves, those who were and never were old lovers from the past. It was a black trunk with brass straps all around. It smelled dank, as though the Atlantic had come to rest in the basement back in the 90s. Or was the smell that of Melville's whale, steeped in literature and threat, throwing itself against the door to tell me it had been aware for years I was just the shadow of Pessoa's hat, an imposter and a would-be heir to Lisboa's big blue sky. Okay, two more. I have yet to make it to Portugal, but my wife and I talk often about it. We've even talked about moving there, but it's talk at this point. This is called Salvation of Any Kind, and in it, she and I finally make it there. It was in January, during a year when the fog came early, trying to cover up our crimes. I remember her delving into the photographs captured during our escape into Lisbon. It had been the only time when, faced with despair, we turned at the corner with the broken sidewalk, looked up at the church that was staring back at us, and decided to laugh. Just laugh. We didn't drop dead then, or now, as the guilt rolled off our shoulders and into the gutters of Lisbon. The Jew and the altar boy had come to grips, kissing each other under the Portuguese moon. The fog continued to cover us, and in heaven, if there was such a place, the owner nodded, ordering more jazz in the names of those who came dressed in fog every year, about this time, to protest salvation in unholy Lisboa or anywhere else that seemed real. And finally, this is something that deals with the things, certain things that you remember that just, happen to stay there in your brain. It's called Certain Things. You tend to remember certain things, important things, like buying a black leather jacket and instantly thinking you look like James Dean just before stepping into the Porsche. There was the time you offered your father a copy of your first book, and he, having never considered the likelihood of your being a man of words or culture, suddenly and without warning, smiled. He'd been afraid for you, thinking you would end up on the corner, just you and those words, along with a cheap red wine. He was closer than he might have ever imagined. But he smiled and shook his old head instead. Finally, there was your mother, who'd always seemed content to stand alone in the background, preparing a beautiful dinner, like the one she did for you and your girl. She presented a carved roast and some fine red potatoes, like you had mentioned once in your work, she said. Then your mother smiled, like your father had done before, when he was alive and looking at what he'd been given. It's fine paper. One could always tell the quality of the writing by its paper. You remembered every tone in his delivery. Your mother smiled at the woman you'd brought to the house for dinner, the one you were going to marry. Everyone explains it this way. If you ask people nicely on a warm afternoon in the valley, the notorious beauty of smiles is always reflected in their tears. Thank you very much, everybody.